Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Timothée Delettre, CEO and Chief of Product at Wizville. We are really happy to welcome you all for the second edition of Dreaming Bigger with Rails, this year organized with the help of Adrien Ciani, CTO at Ecotable. So we're going to kick off the event in English and then switch to French starting from the second talk. So can you all hear me well? Can you use the chat to tell me that you're all hearing me well? Okay, I see hi, hey. Well, great. So to let everyone settle in, I'm going to share a little reminder about the topic today, and we'll start the talk with David in just a few moments. But first, I'd like to remind a little bit about what's about today. So as most of you know, 2021 has been a crazy year for French tech and for tech as a whole, of course, with record fundraisings, lots of new unicorns, etc., incredible growth. Never had we been dreaming that big in France. But what makes those shiny numbers possible is first and foremost the ability of those teams, the engineering team, to reinvent themselves, right? To keep their customers happy on the long run, implementing new tech and scaling their apps. But to succeed, you also need to keep learning all the time, and learning from the best helps. That's why today we're so lucky to have some of the best thinkers and doers from the Rails ecosystem coming to share with us their story and how they reached their crazy goals. So at Wizville, we are eager to hear them, of course, and to share a little bit as well. Just a little word about us, because last year some of you guys had feedback about that. So who are we? We are a SaaS startup based in Paris, but we are really a remote team based in France, full remote team. We have an office in Paris as well, and we build a customer satisfaction management platform for big retailers. Obviously, we are Rails-based. So our goal in 2022, our vision is that Net Promoter Score management and customer satisfaction management is going to change forever. It's going to be more and more based on data science, and we think tomorrow companies will be able to automatically know what they need to improve in terms of customer satisfaction to drive more sales and beat the competition. Of course, to make that crazy vision possible, because reinventing NPS, Net Promoter Score, is not a small thing. We're always hiring senior Rails developers. You'll find a link in the chat panel on the right-hand side. So before we get into the details of the agenda, please do share your questions in the Q&A panel and vote for questions you like. Tech questions welcome most of all. Donc partagez vos questions dans le menu Q&A, hein, votez pour celles qui vous intéressent. On fera notre mieux donc pour répondre à l'ensemble des questions. All right, so little reminder about the agenda today. So we'll kick off the event, the talk with David in a few moments. But so David, the goal would be to have his vision on Hotwire and the most interesting tech he's seen in 2021. Then we'll have Soware and Dr. Lib, the head of engineering of those two companies, share with us how they took their Rails stacks to the next level in 2021. And we'll see that they had huge challenges, as you can imagine. And finally, we'll talk to three of the most intrepid Rails developers in France who will share their journeys from 0 to 1 with Hotwire. So it's 4:04. David, you have until 4:50. What do you think about logging in right now? Cool, perfect. Adrien, can you join us as well? All right, so David, you already know Adrien. His nickname is Intrepid on GitHub, and I asked him to pitch in because he's the dev and I'm the product guy. So thanks for being here again, David.
Sure, it's my pleasure to be back.
Well, first of all, as discussed over email, I'd just like to remind, so we talk about Hotwire and the coolest new tech you've implemented or seen in 2021, because the goal is to inspire the Rails community to think about new ways to actually tackle the problems they've been facing and discover interesting new solutions to help them scale and succeed. But first of all, we're going to talk about Hotwire, and I'm sure that some people here have little knowledge about it. Can you just summarize in a few words or a minute or two what's the tech about?
Sure. So Hotwire is a different approach to dealing with the front end in a way that does not give up any of the fidelity or user experience of traditional front end approaches like React and so forth, but does so with a sliver of the complexity to do so. It focuses on server rendered templates, which funnily enough, as soon as we started talking about Hotwire, it seemed like other people got the same good idea at the same time that, hey, wait a minute, rendering templates on the server actually brings a bunch of benefits, both to end users and to developers. So it's something that's been happening inside the JavaScript community for some time as well now. And Hotwire just came out the gate and said, like, this is what we're focusing on. We're focusing on providing that front-end experience that's just as good as it would be with any other toolkit, but allowing developers the productivity and the joy of writing their applications in their favorite programming languages. And of course, this is near and dear to my heart because Ruby is my favorite programming language. I don't mind JavaScript. In fact, I've come to sort of even like it over the years as the platform has improved, but I still like Ruby so much more. So I want to write the bulk of my applications in the language I like the best. And I've also found that writing web applications from the back end out rather than the other way around is a far more productive way to work. And it allows us to escape some of the complexities that are just present with the JavaScript ecosystems and tool stacks and bundlers and transpilers and all this other stuff that's going on in the JavaScript world. That's all exciting in its own sense, but I think also overly complicated in a lot of other ways. So Hotwire fundamental idea is that what we should be sending over the wire is HTML. Therefore, the name Hotwire is an abbreviation of HTML over the wire. So instead of sending JSON over the wire and having a JavaScript application running on the front end that takes that JavaScript and then turns it into HTML and then rehydrates and all this other stuff, you simply just send the HTML that you want straight from the server, which means that you get to generate that HTML in whichever way you would like. And as I just said, I get to generate it with Ruby. People who are working with Laravel get to generate it in PHP, and these other communities that have taken
exactly.
up
Other
Hotwire as
communities
well.
are taking up Hotwire as well. And I have good news for you because 90% of the people present on the chat said that they already know about Hotwire, and we have about 25% of them who actually use it on a daily basis, more or less.
Awesome.
So,
yeah, I think
that's
what's been so interesting and awesome about Hotwire is that it seems like it's hit at just the right moment. I mean, the interesting, funny thing about Hotwire is it's based on a bunch of ideas that I've been advancing, promoting, using for well over 10 years. The core of Hotwire, there are new elements, but some of the core elements are very time-tested, turbo links and other ideas that we've been working with for a long time. But when we introduced those ideas, the time just wasn't right. React dominated the conversation when it came to the front end, and people just weren't interested in hearing about something else. And I think now enough people have built enough apps and hit enough walls with the traditional JavaScript front end
That's
approach.
interesting because you're telling us that you've been working on this for more or less 10 years, and now you're releasing it because you think there's more interest. We'll talk about mobile because we see that you're building mobile in Hey,
Yes.
and you
Yes.
still haven't released something official on mobile, but
well, we have.
we'll
I mean, I think that's actually. I saw that question scroll about what about Strata, but Hotwire as it exists today has some wonderful toolkits for both iOS and for Android, where you can use Hotwire today with those things. The Strata component, which we still have yet to release, is the final sprinkles on top that makes some things a little better. But we've already delivered 95% of all the stuff that you would want to use if you're building
that's
mobile apps.
Okay, that's a good information because you said the same thing last year, and we'll get into the details with Adrian. But since our last talk, early 2021, first, many thanks for summarizing it. But since our last talk, early 2021, how do you feel about the evolution of Hotwire as a project? in terms of release, community growth, feedbacks?
It's been amazing, and it's been amazing in ways that are a little surprising to me. We put it out there as a continuation of all this other work that we had done with Turbolinks and so on that didn't really have necessarily a big reaction. In fact, some people were actively hostile against Turbolinks for many years, and now the sentiments have totally changed. And I keep hearing from team after team who've gone like, yeah, do you know what? We just weren't delivering the updates. We weren't creating the progress that we wanted to see with the existing toolkits that we were using. And oftentimes that was something like React, Redux, all this other stuff. And they were just like, they weren't happy with what they were using. And that sense of unhappiness is what opens the mind to new possibilities, that you go like, this isn't right. Maybe I'm going to try something else. Maybe they watch a video of Hotwire. Maybe they try just one of the demos and they go like, interesting. And then they'll do a small scaffolding thing. They'll experiment with it. And before you know it, you're like, yeah, we've switched over to Hotwire, which is just so cool to hear.
I wish you could stay later, because our most intrepid of developers shot videos of their apps where they use Hotwire and show exactly what you're saying, showcase how well it works. And they've also shared feedbacks about there's a big part of the game, the software game, which is legacy code, right? And so you have 12 months advance on all of us, right? On Hotwire. So what about it? What about legacy code? What about maintainability? Can you tell us more, since you're 20 months in more than us, right? I mean, it's been 24 months since you've been kind of using Hotwire.
Yeah, I mean, that's since we released it, but I mean, we've been using all these tools for years. So a lot of these tools and techniques, they're not speculative. It's not like I came up with a funny idea and then I released it more or less at the same time as we were trying to use it. No, we released it after we proved it. We released it after we'd been using it for years. And validated that this is a good way to build apps. In fact, we built an entire app from scratch around these concepts, which is Hey. We spent about 2 years building that. It's been in the market now for about 1.5 years. So 3.5 years ago was when we sort of started with like, okay, these are the ideas we're going to put into a brand new greenfield application. And Hey has just been an absolute pleasure to work with. What excites me doubly so is that Hotwire has sort of dovetailed with a bunch of other fundamental advances in web development that all came together in Rails 7. That Hotwire became the new default front-end framework in Rails 7, but then we also had all these other advances that allowed us to escape from under the complexity of the JavaScript sort of regime. Import maps, getting rid of Webpacker, taking all these HTTP2, getting rid of bundling. I'm working on something brand new right now that we haven't really talked too much about, but it's a replacement for Sprockets called PropShaft. And PropShaft is basically saying like, how would you write Sprockets today if you could rely on not having to bundle, not having to transpile? HTTP2 is there, import maps is there. It's just this massive simplifications over the thing that kind of became a little bit of a monstrosity with Sprockets. And it's all possible because there have been these fundamental advances in what we can do. The browsers just got good enough. And this is, you talked about what's exciting in 2021. Well, the most exciting thing for me in 2021 was the fact that Chrome shipped with native support for import maps. And import maps is this enabling technology that does such that we don't need Webpack. We don't even need ESBuild. We don't need any of these transpilers and bundlers in order to use modern JavaScript, in order to use libraries of NPM. And this is what Hey is running on now. Hey does not use any form of JavaScript transpilation. It doesn't use any form of JavaScript bundling. I'm just wrapping up the PR before I jumped on this call to to move Hey from Sprockets to PropShaft. And I think it's just it's so cool to see that we're finally entering a phase where things can become simpler. For the past 10 years in web development, things have just become more and more and more and more complex. We built more things on top of more things on top of more things. And if you were starting or you're trying to do something, there was just so much to learn. There were so many things to set up. And we're finally getting to the point where it's going to go downhill from now. And I think that is incredibly exciting that that all the pieces
That's
are there. And the other
exciting
thing
for
too, that
the
we finally have a full answer. I feel like for so long time, when we were talking like, how do you build apps at Basecamp, we'd say like, well, we use Rails, we use Turbolinks, and we use this internal thing and that internal thing and that internal thing. Now there's no more internal things. Literally everything that we use to build Hey and our new apps, it's out there. It's easy to use. It's the defaults, and that's awesome.
Adrian had a question about Hey. Adrian, can you first like introduce yourself? I mean, you guys
hi David,
know each other, but all the other
and hi everyone.
guys here or girls here don't.
Can you guys hear me well?
Sure.
Yeah. So as Tim mentioned, I'm Adrien. I'm CTO at Ecotab. We're a French company aiming to reduce the environmental footprint of restaurants through code. I've been a Rails developer for more than 10 years now, still very much in love. And I think I'm one of the early developers of Hotwire. I've been using it since RC2 in production. So I'm super happy to be here today with the community and with you, David, to talk about all that. So yeah, you mentioned Strada earlier. So obviously mobile is a big topic for software companies. Could you expand on your vision on how Strada and the existing Turbolinks adapter articulate? So how today is the best way to build a hybrid application with Hotwire?
Yes, the best way is to start with the native adapters. There's one for iOS and there's one for Android, which are built around Turbolinks powered web views. And then what Strada adds on top is a sort of set of conventions of how you can make the HTML communicate with your native app such that you can transform HTML elements into native elements. We have some parts of Hey, for example, you'll tap on something and a native dialogue will appear, but that native dialogue was actually instrumented from the HTML. It was not code that was written in the app itself. And you can do all of these things today. Strada just gives you a little bit of a roadmap on how to do it. But as I said, it's sort of like the last sprinkles. Lots of apps won't even need it. Lots of apps you will simply build around the turbo adapters, and you'll use the web views and you'll build your native navigations as you have your tap bar at the bottom or whatever that's switching between these web views. So I kind of regret that we even previewed Strada. We should just have shut up about it, because then it could just drop as like, hey, here's another thing that makes things a little bit easier, rather than people thinking, oh, there's something missing before I can even get started, because that's not true at all. You should get started now. And in fact, plenty of people are, and plenty of people have, and have already built Hotwire apps that ship for
Adrian,
iOS.
can I pitch in on this? Because when we prepared the event, you told me that you still needed React Native, if you wanted to use Hotwire.
Yeah. So the idea is what you've described, David, requires native development, and
yes.
I think that I love about the whole Rails ecosystem today is that if you just know Ruby and JavaScript today, you can do a lot of things, especially with new tools like Tailwind CSS that I really enjoy using. Vue component built by GitHub. You can have like a pretty amazing Rails application on the web, but you still need to learn new technologies like Kotlin and Swift if you want to expand on the mobile side. And the thing is, if you're a very small team on the web, it's fine, because one person can build a great app with Ruby and JavaScript. But if you want to build a mobile app, you need to learn new stuff. So obviously people are turning to React Native, which allow you to build apps in JavaScript. And my dream would be to have kind of the best of both worlds, being able to build an app in React Native and Hotwire. Do you think it's something that could happen?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, what we've built is set up in some ways for the fact that at Basecamp, we have native developers, and that we're competing against native apps like the Gmail app and so on, and don't want to go through any levels of abstraction to get there to do that competition. But I totally agree that that that's a high barrier to go in. The good thing is that like you can use whatever you want, Ionic, React Native, whatever, all these other wrapping tools that will wrap a web application. They work just as well for Hotwire. You don't actually need to use these native adapters that sort of give you the 100% fidelity of it. If you take a Hotwire app that's already great on the web and you put it inside Ionic or React Native or any of these other toolkits that wrap web views, you're still winning, right? Like you still get to use this amazing web app that you have, and you give it just the minimum amount of Chrome that you can in some abstraction. So I think that's a totally fine and valid path to go. We build out the sort of I don't want to say excuses, but full fidelity approach, right? Like where you can slide it all the way where the apps can have parts of it that's a fully native, with the highest fidelity you can possibly build using the latest APIs the day after they've been released. All these sort of compromises you sometimes have to make when you use some of these other wrapping toolkits. We were not interested in making those trade-offs for our apps, but that was premised on the fact that we have native developers. So yeah, I'd love to see more development, that more people talking about like how to use Hotwire with React Native or with Ionic or something else that is more realistic for a single developer to be able to work with. One of the greatest drives for me when designing Rails is the notion of the one-person framework. So if we can extend the one-person framework to also include native applications in the app stores.
Yeah, that
so
would be
so
great.
that actually relates to some of the next questions we had. So what's been, in your opinion, the most impactful tech change you and your team have made to Basecamp stack in 2021?
It was getting rid of Webpacker. So we were running on Webpacker before. We upgraded to Rails 7. In Basecamp, interestingly enough, because it's sort of an app that has its roots back from 2013, I think was when that repo was created. It's like it's got a lot of code, and this has JavaScript code in particular that was written in the style of jQuery. We still have jQuery elements in Basecamp. Then we've evolved it over the years. So there's sort of a lot more legacy code as it comes to the JavaScript. So in that case, the jump from where we are to the full default of Rails 7 with import maps was too far. So what we did instead, we yanked out Webpacker and we put in JS bundling -Rails with ES build. And that was a really nice upgrade as well that got rid of all that complexity of Webpacker. It still uses sort of a node setup, and it's halfway there. But then on the other hand, with Hey, which is a fresher, newer code base that was built entirely around all of these modern approaches to JavaScript, we were able to jump straight to the import map approach. No node is required to work on Hey, which is just a wonderful thing. I mean, I am looking forward to the day where I don't need to have Node installed on my machine at all. And part of this is being enabled by not just the things that we've been making with Rails 7, but some of these other trends that are happening in the industry. You look at Tailwind CSS, for example, a very popular CSS framework. They've also realized, you know what? Not everyone wants to install Node and deal with the complexity of it. The amount of support emails they get about the Node parts of setting Tailwind up rather than the Tailwind parts of Tailwind is pretty spectacular. So what they've done is they've created standalone executables. And this is really interesting. You boil down the entire framework of Tailwind to a standalone single executable that has all the Node components in it that it needs, but does not require them to be installed. And we've taken that, and then this actually forms the basis now of Tailwind CSS-Rails, which is actually something we're using for some internal tooling. We're using Tailwind for a little bit of backend tooling on some of our apps. And the same thing is happening with Sass. So Css Compilation, on the one hand, you have Tailwind. That's a great approach. I really like Tailwind for a lot of things. And I particularly like Tailwind when it's developers who have to do the styling, because they can get components, they can buy components, they can copy and paste and make things look better more easily. And then if you have an entire sort of designer staff, as we do, who for them, Tailwind doesn't offer that much. They want to work directly with CSS. Then Sass is still a good solution. And Sass has followed the same path as Tailwind has. There is now a single executable for Sass, so that you can use the latest version of Sass, which is based on Dart, as a single executable. So I think that's a really, really interesting advancement, that we have all these tools that no longer require sort of all the machinery to compile them. You can just get them as a single executable. And I think it's sort of like, I remember Gen 2 Linux, this distribution of Linux where you would compile it from scratch and it took like 18 hours to install. And that's the stage we're kind of stuck in with a lot of JavaScript tooling. A lot of people want to use some of these JavaScript tools, but they have to install Gen 2 basically and 5,000 node dependencies to be able to use it. That's just kind of crazy. And particularly for an environment like Rails, where like, that's not what we're here for. I'm here to write the bulk of my code in Ruby. I want to use some node-based tooling. I don't want to use Node.
And following up on that, so people are now able to use Node less and less, and this makes me think like the usual way the technical teams are organized is, I mean, the classical way is a front-end team and a back-end team, and now we've seen that full stack development is kind of becoming cool again, with stuff like obviously Hotwire, but also Livewire, Phoenix Live View. We've seen also React server-side components. I think they've been introduced a few days before Hotwire was announced. Do you think this movement is going to shift the way software teams are organized?
I sure hope so, because the thing is, we never left. Like the Basecamp organization has been one of full stack developers, literally from day one, where I was the single developer, all the way through our existence. And I observed what happened with this dualism, where we split up in front end and we split up in back end. And I thought, like, what a shame. What a regression. We're able to do less in longer time than we ever were before. Where's the advance in that? Right? You look at what it took to create a web application back in 2006, 2007, before this dualism happened. And then you looked at how long it took in 2015, and you're like, we haven't improved things, have we? Like, maybe we've improved some things around the edges, and there are some interesting technologies that's come out of this. But the fact that we've gotten less productive over time, that's the wrong way. So I feel like that's what's happening with Hotwire and Rails 7, and the excitement about it is that people are finally realizing, like, hey, wait a minute. We ended up going in a wrong direction for a while, and we ended up needing larger and larger teams, which required more and more funding, which required more and more complexity. I mean, this is why so much of this is intertwined. So all the books that Jason and I have written together, from rework to remote to doesn't have to be crazy at work to getting real, they're all based on these notion of efficiencies and making a small team be able to do more. Have small teams be as competitive as possible. And I don't think our tools have been in service of that model or that goal for a very long time. A lot of the tooling that was adopted over the past 10 years came out of mega corporations. It came out of the Facebooks and the Amazons and whatever of the world. And they were designed for huge teams full of specialists who just knew how to do one thing very well. And that worked great when you have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of developers. It works really poorly if you have 1, 2, or 4, or 10. And I always had my allegiance with the 1, 2, 4, or 10 style shops. This is why I'm sort of so enamored with the idea of the one-person framework. This is where we came from. These are my people. These are the ones I want to help. I don't actually care that much about helping a company that has 1,000 employees, because do you know what? They have enough resources. They can figure things out on their own. They don't actually need the help of a really productive tool chain. The 1 person, the 5 person, the 10 person company absolutely does. If they are going to be able to compete with much larger established companies in their industries, they need all the help they can get. And I kind of feel like it's almost like it was a trap that all these companies laid out, the trap of React, the trap of Redux, and like company after company just walked straight into the trap like a lemming, and then they got caught up in this web of complexity, and they were able to do much less, and it took much longer, and thus were far less competitive. yeah, that's not good pace.
Sure. And so more generally, looking back at 2021, what's the single most exciting new tech you've seen, maybe non-Rails related, something that could be different?
Well, I mean, 2021 for me was all about the front end. It was all about figuring it out. And it was in some ways all about the rebellion against Node. Again, I think we owe Node a great debt of gratitude for what it's brought and how it's advanced things. But holy shit, if this was what we had to do until the end of time, I'd be sad. So the fact that it's almost like the negative space. I'm excited about the negative space. I'm excited about how Node and JavaScript as such is retreating from dominating the conversation around everything. The interesting thing about Hotwire, of course, and why it's so exciting to a lot of people is that it's all about the negative space. It allows you to do many of the same things that people in the past would have used a ton of JavaScript to do without any JavaScript barely at all. When we shipped Hey, 30K of compressed JavaScript. 30K. Now, compare that to the competitors in our space in email. Gmail, for example, 4.8 megabytes. Like, it's just a different universe. It's like orders of magnitude difference. And that happened because of all these underlying advances in the tech, in the browsers, in the standards, and all these things that have kind of just been waiting for a long time. That, like, you know what? We can't deal with this complexity until some of these things are solved, until the browsers are all running a modern version of JavaScript, until all the old browsers had been sort of put out to pasture. I think one of the exciting things is, again, in this negative space, when Microsoft announced that IE 11 was no longer be supported, I think that was announced in the spring of 2021. I was like, yay, finally, right? Like, when even Microsoft gives up on IE 11, you're allowed to give up on IE 11, which means that we only basically have to deal with evergreen browsers. Safari is now sometimes a little bit of a thorn in our shoe. But you look at Edge, you look at Chrome, you look at Firefox. These are all modern browsers that are staying evergreen. So when I look at our usage statistics, what are our users using? The vast majority are on the latest version because the browsers just update in the background. And that's really exciting. The fact that import maps shipped in spring of 2021, like a month later, 90%, 95% of all Chrome users just had it because Chrome just updated in the background, and boom, now you're getting native import maps in your browser. That's not something that used to be true, right?
Yeah, that's so nice. I mean, it's a new world, but it should always have been like that, right?
Yes, and I hope that, like, Safari finds a way to get onto that wagon as well. It's a bit annoying. What's sort of happening there because of Apple's monopoly and because we can't get a different browser on iOS. Everyone simply has to use Safari. I actually happen to like Safari as a browser, as a user, but as a developer, I'm getting increasingly frustrated that they're lagging so far behind on many standards.
What's interesting in what strikes me in the beginning of your answer is that you compared it to Node.js for the philosophical part, right? But there's also a strategic part, no? For the Rails community as a whole. You feel, and I feel it too as an entrepreneur and as a product guy, that Node.js has been having this momentum, right? And this hurts us, us startups too, when we want to hire, new
Yes.
Rails developers. So for you, is it only like the passion and the philosophy behind JavaScript that you want to fight, or it's also, that the community that you want to see keep growing in the future, in the years to come?
Well, the funny thing is sometimes it sounds like I'm fighting JavaScript, but I'm really not. I'm fighting for Ruby. I'm trying to do a positive fight here where more people get to write Ruby more of the time. And hopefully they get to write Ruby with Rails, because it's just, I'm 20 years into that, right? 20 years ago, more or less, I started working on Ruby and Rails, and I still fucking love it. It's still the best platform. And I'm a curious person. I check out everything. I try everything. I'm not actually attached in that sense.
Is there going to be an anniversary party for the 20 years?
Yeah. I mean, if I found something else where I went like, oh, do you know what? That's just better. I'd drop whatever I was doing and I'd do that instead. right? Like Webpacker is actually an interesting example. I wrote the first version of Webpacker. I shoved it into Rails, and then something better came along, and I was like, let's get this Webpacker shit out of here, right? You have to be sort of on the pursuit of like, I want it better, I want it more beautiful, I want it more productive, and then whatever delivers that is a good thing. So, but at the same time, it is satisfying to see that a lot of people are coming to the same conclusions at the same time. I feel like we have a momentum in the Rails and Hotwire communities now that we just didn't have a little while ago, because everyone was so enamored by Node.js and so enamored with React.
Just figures to share, numbers to show that there is this growth of the community. Do you have comparisons with the other frameworks?
I don't really. I mean, I think sometimes it descends usually into something silly. One of the things that people often do is they compare Google searches, right? Which, if you're going to win that battle, you should make the worst documented, shittiest framework ever that requires a lot of Googling all the time to figure out even the basics and how they work, right? Then you're going to win who has the most Google searches. It's such a perverse competition in my mind.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, if you look at we talked with the developers and they share the same thing. I mean, it's natural to use. You need it less. But
yes, and the more you learn it, the less you need it. And the older it is, and the more the community is full of veterans who figure things out, the less you need it, right? The fact is that a stability, well-documented framework just requires less Googling to solve your problems. That should be a feature, not a bug. So I think some of these things very often, they become silly. And even more to that point, I don't want to dominate anything. I don't want to look at this in terms of a fight for market share. I want to look at escape velocity. That's the thing that's important to me, that a community is self-sustaining, that there's enough people there that are working on it, that we fix things and we have the solutions to the major problems that we face. And Rails got escape velocity a very long time ago and still maintains it. You look at new versions of Rails, like we just released Rails 7, and I think 600, 700 people had code changes in that version over the course of a year, something like that. More than 6,000 people have contributed code to Rails over the duration. So I think it's one of those things where you just need to get to good enough. You need to have enough of a community, enough people there that like most answers have already arrived, and then anyone can jump in, and then more power to it that we have all these other communities. I'm thrilled that some people like Go, other people like Elixir, all these other things, because what I find is the miserable programmer is the programmer who's being forced to use an ecosystem that they don't like. And this is what's, to me, is so important about Ruby on Rails. It's full of people who like Ruby on Rails. Like, that's not actually true for a lot of other domains. JavaScript is a great example. A lot of people are forced to use JavaScript. They don't choose it. It's simply what they have to use, partly because JavaScript is a language you have to use to deal with the front end, so everyone has to deal with it to some extent. And part of it is because the wave has been so big that like some people feeling like, oh, do you know what? Where should I go to get a job or whatever? The easiest thing perhaps right now is JavaScript. And that reminds me a lot of how it used to be in the old days with Java. A lot of people were forced to use Java and they fucking hated it.
So you think JavaScript and Node.js will have the same future as Java did in the past years? I mean,
to some extent, well, I mean, I think there's just a self-sustaining thing. Given the fact that JavaScript has a monopoly on the front end of the browser, it's always going to be a very big language, unless something drastic happens that totally changes that equation. But as long as that is true, that they have that monopoly on the front end, JavaScript is going to be a big thing. I think the unfortunate wrong turn we took was that because JavaScript has this monopoly on the front end, a lot of people were fooled into believing that it would be advantageous to them to also use it on the back end. This idea of isomorphism, I give it basically fucking no value. There's almost no value in like, oh, I get to use the same language back and forth. Yeah, and then you have to use SQL, and then you have to use a bunch of other things. Like, you have to learn more than one thing. And that's actually not such a bad thing. It's much worse to think like, oh, we have to use JavaScript on the back end because that's what we use on the front end.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your answers. So we wanted to give a little time to the community to actually share their questions. So we have a few questions, many questions that you could take, and when you have to go, you go. We know that you have something important with the
Actually,
house stuff.
it got delayed, so I have a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Yes.
That's great. So I was going to ask another question then. I had a question. When you scale your startup in your app, you always have those problems, right? That are maybe are specific to you. Maybe some others share. Can you share a problem on the tech side and the product that you might have had in 2021 and how you tackled it?
Yeah. So when we launched Hey, we launched an email service, which is not something that happens every other day, because email is really fucking hard these days to be able to deliver it reliably without ending up in spam and all these other things. There's just a ton of things to learn and figure out, and like just the number of problems we had to solve to be able to make Hey competitive with something like Gmail were enormous. Spam actually is a good example. There is just a litany of standards for how you have to sign emails and how you have to warm your IPs, for example. That's one of those concepts that I learned about. I mean, one of the reasons we got the courage to take on the email problem was the fact that at Basecamp, when we started developing Hey several years ago, we were sending 5 million emails a day. Right. And we were sending it through our own infrastructure. We were not using SendGrid or something else like that. So we already had like a core understanding, like this is how we send email. But that's still quite different to send transactional emails versus sending other people's emails that might be marked as spam. So we had to do a bunch of things with quarantining when we launched Hey World, which we launched in 2021. We had to quarantine that again because now we were hosting newsletters. And newsletters have even more of a propensity to get marked as spam, and we can't risk damaging the IP reputations that we had for the main service and so forth. So, all the stuff and the mechanics and the complexity of how to run an email server. It's funny because we walked into that problem knowing like, okay, this is going to be a little difficult. We know that sending email and being an email service. And if I knew then what I know now about how difficult it actually is, then I might have gone like, and maybe we should find another problem to try to solve. I can totally appreciate why it's so rare that new email services are launched.
Exactly.
Like you think back, when was the last major one? Proton Mail and Fastmail, both over 10 years old. And then before that, it was Gmail, right? Like it is so rare that someone launches a new service. I mean, new clients and new plugins and so on, they come every other day. But new services, very rare. And I've learned why that is because it's really damn difficult.
Fucking hard, yeah. Exactly. Great. Well, thank you very much for that. So are your IPs warm enough and everything's going through now?
Yes.
It's better. Great. Well, congrats for that because I know it's a really hassle. So we have great questions from the community. Would you want to take them?
Yes, sure.
One after one.
Yeah. Are you using Sorbet or ABS at Basecamp? Absolutely not. I am an avowed how to put it skeptic of static typing. If we had to do it again with Hotwire, absolutely, I would not write it in TypeScript. I fucking hate TypeScript. TypeScript just gives me the heebie-jeebies, and I understand why some people like it. I understand the integrations and tab completion in VS Code and so forth. So it's not like I can't appreciate it, and it's not like I haven't tried it, but there's a reason I like Ruby. Ruby is one of the most dynamic languages in the world. And in fact, it's one of the reasons I like JavaScript so much too, because it isn't statically typed. So Sorbet or ABS has no interest to me, and I dearly, sincerely hope that they never become standard in the Ruby world.
Sylvain, do you want to pitch in because you're also a presenter, so maybe you want to answer and dig in a little bit more in that question. If you don't, we'll go to the next question.
No, thank you so much for David for answering. I think what kind of led this question is recently we have gone through a massive refactoring in our Rails code base, And it's true that without types, you really need to ensure that your tests have decent coverage.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's so easy to,
Yes.
to miss something. And so for this reason, I was considering, like, would sorbet or RBS be an option?
I will say that, like, the only fond memories I have of static typing was doing Java development for a little while using the IntelliJ IDE, and particularly the refactoring tools in the IntelliJ IDE. There are benefits, but I think the benefits in terms of correctness are vastly overstated. Oftentimes, what I find when we refactor is not that the types aren't right. Is that we change some logic in some ways that we get the wrong result. It's still an integer. It's just the wrong fucking integer. So I think those tests are a better, more comprehensive way of solving the problem anyway, which is also one of the reasons why I'm not that keen on it. We have good test coverage at Basecamp. I consider it a basic hygiene factor. If you think you can get away with just type safety, and that's how you're going to assure correctness, you have another thing coming. Absolutely not. The vast majority of programming errors are not type errors. They are logic errors. Adrian asks, any plan for a Flutter React native adapter? I hope someone has a plan for it. It's just not me. This is one of the wonderful things about the community, that we can solve different problems that we want to tackle because we want to use those things. I don't see us at Basecamp ever using a Flutter or React adapter because I don't see us using any of those things. We have native developers and we do the native Android and iOS thing. So I would love to see someone in the community step up and do some work around that, explain how to do it, and not just for those adapters, but also for the other whatever Ionic and whatever they're called, that make it really easy and very entry level to create some of these wrappers. Love to see it. But
there used to be an adapter for TurboLinks with React Native, so hopefully someone does the same for Turbo. Yeah.
Totally. Love to see it. Kim asks, I love Hotwire and see great potential in it, but learning it is kind of hard. I have trouble finding good resources. Do you have any recommendations? We put a fair amount of effort into the website, so making sure that you follow all the tutorials and read through the reference documentation and so forth. And then there's a bunch of good YouTube channels that if you actually even, I did this the other day, if you just search Hotwire on YouTube, there's a bunch of good tutorials that will give you that basic way to get going. And then just try to build something. The best way I find to learn something is I take a real problem I have. Oh, I want to do live search, for example. And then how would I do it the Hotwire way and figure that out? There's also a great discussion forum at discuss.hotwire.dev, I think it is, hotwired.dev. So you can use that as well. Yaroslav asks some tips on migrating from Webpacker to import maps ES build. Yeah, I wanted to do a video on this. Never got around to it, and perhaps partly because there was so little in it. We actually have a guide on the JS bundling -Rails, I think it is, that explains how to move from Webpacker to Webpack with JS bundling Rails. There really is not a lot to it unless you've made all sorts of crazy extensions and hacks and whatever on top of it. If you're running a mostly vanilla Webpacker setup, there's very little to it. But yeah, I'd love to see someone just do more of a point-by-point tutorial. I haven't had the time to do it yet. Ideas to improve the experience with Stimulus and TypeScript. Yeah, I think I sort of betrayed my answer earlier there. Is I am not a TypeScript fan. I don't use the TypeScripts at all. I write all my JavaScript in TextMate. No interest in any of that. So if there are others who want to do that work, and there have been some work done there, I know there are contributors to the Hotwire projects that do use TypeScript and like it. I'd be happy to see that advance, but it's not something I personally have an interest in. How do you use import maps without Webpacker? It seems like it's not supported in all browsers. How does it work? Safari, for example, that is correct. Import maps is natively supported in Edge and Chrome, but there's a wonderful shim that works perfectly that makes it work in Firefox and Safari. We would never have been able to use import maps. I would never have made it the default unless there was this rock solid way of using it across all the major browsers. We're running it right now in Hey, and people are using all the browsers in the world to access Hey, and it works wonderfully. So the shim is already there when you run the Rails 7 setup. The import maps -Rails plugin includes the shim. It's auto-configured. There's nothing for you to do. It basically works as though it was native. Possible to add rendering options to Hotwire, broadcast and broadcast to. I'm not quite sure what that covers. Pretty sure we have most things covered. If they aren't, open a pull request and yeah, add some of that. When will we see Strata? We're working on it actively this year. So 2022, I hope. But again, remember, it's the sprinkling up top. It's the cherry on top. It's not the whole sundae. You can get started absolutely now. Attracting more front-end developers to work in Rails Hotwire environments. I think some of that has to come from like shops deciding that this is what they're going to build in, which sounds like there's already a bunch of shops in France deciding to do this. And then when you hire new people, they get introduced to it. I think in today's environment, a lot of it is driven by what do we use at work? So when work changes over, I think so will others. But yeah. Recommended way to test front-end features. We do integration testing only at both Hey and Basecamp. We don't do any JavaScript-specific testing. I've always found those JavaScript-specific testings to be very sort of brittle. Not to say that integration testing is not also brittle. I spend way too much time fighting with system tests because driving a browser is a brittle thing. So I've actually moderated my recommendation on that a bit. I used to be like, oh yeah, let's build a bunch of system tests because they test everything end to end. And like, that's true, but they're also such a pain in the ass to deal with that you got to trade that off. And we use a bunch of controller tests. We use a bunch of unit tests, and they are far more predictable. They run much faster. So I'm more to the sense you should have some system tests, but I don't try to get 100% coverage through system tests because they're just too much of a pain in the ass to work with. Worried that big shops like Shopify and GitHub will slowly, through their influence, make Rails more focused around being productive at mega scale rather than launching a new product. No, I'm not, because as long as I am involved with Rails, Rails is going to be a one-person framework. That is the driving primary target for me. And there have been moments where this has come up where like we have discussions about like what the API should be or other things like that. And I have a laser focus on, I want Rails to be a one-person framework. So I don't think so. In fact, I'd say the opposite is true, that Shopify and GitHub has contributed a range of stuff that really helps people who are getting further along the line of Hello World to IPO. When you get closer to IPO and you have bigger teams and you're dealing with all sorts of things, all the work GitHub, for example, did on multiple databases and primary and replica setups, and so it was wonderful work that we ended up using at Basecamp. One of those great features that did not premiere at Basecamp, but we just like, wow, this is such a gift. We had this hobbled together solution, and here comes this wonderfully polished API that's been battle tested at GitHub, and we could just use it, and it just worked. So I think that's great. Like, let Shopify and GitHub in particular focus around the issues at IPO level, and I and many others will focus around the issues closer to the Hello World stage.
Thank you very much, David. I mean, if you've been taking many questions and you've shared a lot of time with us.
Well, we're almost done, so I might as well just
sure.
blast through the last ones. Where does Hey get most of its traffic from? The apps or web? Absolutely the apps. It's actually really interesting. Hey, to some extent, tragically as it is mainly an iOS app. The vast majority of our paid users, or the biggest group of paid users, are from people who use it on their iPhone, which is also one of the reasons I had this big spat with Apple about 1.5 years ago, because if we had got cut off from that platform, Hey in its current form would not exist or cannot exist. I mean, not that you can't run a web desktop browser-based email client. It would just be a very small one because almost everyone need to get their email on their phone. So you need an app for it. Last one was, what do you think of the Ruby release schedule? Is it mature enough that we should still have one big release a year? It works for me. I mean, the funny thing with the Ruby release schedule is like Ruby has been great for me for 15 years. Right? Like it's very rare that I look at something and go like, wow, that's amazing. I think perhaps when we got keyword arguments, that was the last thing where I really went, hallelujah. Other than that, I'm just like, hey, it got a little faster. There's a few nice little trinkets. The magic of Ruby for me is I get to make it myself. Active support is our Rails's version of Ruby. And whenever there's something I'm missing in Ruby, I just do it myself. Well, let's just add it. I mean, I've seen some commentary, and there's some people who don't like that freedom patching is a thing that you can do, and active support uses that a lot and so forth. But to me, it's one of the absolute key reasons why Ruby is such a wonderful programming language. We all get to evolve it. We don't have to wait for Mats to come up with a new good idea. I think that was it.
Yeah, I think that was. Thank you very, very much, David. I mean, it's been really inspiring. I hope you had a good time.
Absolutely, this is great, and it's a lot of fun and inspiring to hear that there's all these entrepreneurs and friends working on these things. Friends have a special place in my heart. I've been racing at Le Mans for many years. I hope to come back this year as well. Yeah, really exciting to hear all the things that's going on, and all the people adopting Hotwire, and not just adopting it, but finding that it works, that it makes it easier to make cool stuff and build great businesses.
It does.
Well, thank you very much, David, and see you next year then.
All right, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much.